Good afternoon to everybody from the Asian Development Headquarters in Manila. We are very delighted for you having joined this session of the Asia Clean Energy Forum on implementing the nationally determined contributions through action plans. For this session, we have a very interesting lineup of speakers and panelists who will share with you their perspectives on how they are implementing the NDCs in their countries despite the challenges that COVID-19 has posed on all of us globally and in this region. As you know, the NDCs are the foundation of the Paris Agreement, and to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, financing these NDCs is an important part. And equally important also is that many of the countries in their nationally determined contributions have brought forth the elements of adapting to climate change. So therein, the objectives related to mitigating climate change, to adapting to climate change, and financing actions and priority areas are the three important pillars to take forward the implementation of the Paris Agreement. 2020 was an important year. Not only from the climate ambition perspective, but also in terms of other developments that have taken place. But despite COVID-19, about 89 parties have submitted their updated climate ambitions, and about 7 of them have submitted their second NDCs, and 4 of them are from the Asia and the Pacific region. So as you can see, there is momentum in addressing climate change, which is a preeminent challenge that is facing the globe, but also particularly the Asia and the Pacific region. And our presenters and panelists today will take you through some of the exciting developments on implementation of NDCs. Let me first introduce to you my colleague, Priyantha Vijayatunga, who's the Director of South Asia Energy Division at the Asian Development Bank. He will be making an opening presentation, and I hand it over to my colleague Priyantha now to take us through some of his opening remarks. Over to you, Priyantha.
Thank you, Preeti. Good afternoon, good morning to all of you, wherever you are speaking from and joining from. I am speaking from Colombo, and I am still in the morning. By the way, so my presentation is going to be very quick, and it's mainly looking beyond nationally determined contributions, and it will be a quick one on what national determined contributions contain, and then beyond NDCs, what do we do, and then how we can connect this, these suggestions to ADB Strategy 2030 and Energy Policy Revision, which is ongoing at the moment, and how ADB can support in this process. Now, as for the nationally determined contributions, as all of us know, all these NDCs mainly contain renewable energy, supply side energy efficiency, and demand side management. These are the key contents as far as the energy side is concerned, as far as NDCs are concerned. And all of us know the energy sector contributes to about 3/4 of the overall GHG emissions today. And whether we can achieve what we really need to achieve, 1.5 degree rise, to limit it to 1.5 degree rise with this kind of interventions, and what we are planning to do, existing policies, existing initiatives with the current NDCs, it's highly unlikely. The experts say that the current NDCs will lead to at least 3 degrees or more temperature rise as we go along by the end of the century. So what can we do? Definitely, we have to go beyond NDCs. You have to go beyond thinking, what we should be doing. Obviously, these NDCs may be updated, maybe a little more ambitious by the time it comes to the next round. But as it stands now, we have to do a lot more than NDCs. Now, how should we go beyond NDCs? And now, if you look at, we really need a clear roadmaps, possibly to set targets for carbon neutrality. Some countries have already done so, but I think we need to have together almost all the countries looking at carbon neutrality, by mid-century, and even carbon negative. Frankly, it's time to talk about being carbon negative rather than just carbon neutrality. And also, we have to have a commitment from all the countries not to seek any more coal power plants. Those who are trying to put up any more coal beyond this point, I think we have to carefully look at it. And I think it's time to shift away from coal completely, from new coal power plants. On existing coal, as much as possible, try to see, we should see how we can phase them out, or not to make sure that they will not extend their lifetimes beyond what it is currently. As quoting Nancy Reagan in a different context, just say no to coal. And then look for alternative fuels. Obviously, the coal can be replaced with many other fuels. May not be that easily done, but we need to think of them. Biomass may be one of them, but people may laugh at us, but we have to think of those alternative fuels. As again, in a different context, quote Muammar Gaddafi, we lived without oil for 5,000 years, and we can live without it for another 5,000 years. Why should we really rely on this kind of fossil fuels all the time? But the important thing is to find justifications to this. As all of us know, I mean, we are sitting in DMCs over here, and when it comes to justification, we cannot always look at this global benefits, global justifications. They will say, no, they polluted, you do the cleaning and we'll enjoy our lives until such time it's really needed. But this is needed. Today it's needed. It's immediate. The requirements are immediate. So you need to convince these countries looking at the local benefits, the local pollutions, and you should look at those co-benefits and make them the co-benefits rather, and convince them based on that. The communities will benefit because you bring down the the air pollution locally, and as a result you bring down the number of deaths, and that helps the country. There can be an economic argument. In fact, increasingly renewables have an economic argument against conventional systems, and then they will say there is the stability issues, also the other issues. Then you have to bring in technology, and we have to convince these countries using the things what we can convince them on, the benefits, the justifications closer to their heart. That's important. And on the ADB side, in the energy policy revision, I don't have to go into strategy 2030. That's very much in line with the new thinking, how we should move along this, the global communities, commitments and the requirements relating to climate mitigation. And we should say no more coal. And in fact, the energy policy revision virtually says no new coal. That's quite clear. And it's not excited about natural gas. Even natural gas, of course, there is a case for natural gas to bring in more and more renewable energy, but we have to keep in mind it should be definitely a transitional fuel, not beyond that. And when we invest in natural gas, we have to think of how long it's going to stay on, and whether it's worth it from economic point of view. Also, if there are going to be stranded assets, there will be issues. And in fact, even today, you see stranded, I mean, in Sri Lanka, where I am sitting, now we have to curtail wind power because you cannot, part load coal power plant beyond a certain limit. Now, what a contradicting situation it is like, we should not come into that point because we have all these stranded assets. We can think of hybrid systems where renewable energies will obviously be able to contribute much more. Isolated communities, definitely we have to look at things like microgrids and all the other technical solutions, and all these are embedded in the new energy policy revision. So ADB can help in various ways. I don't want to go into details of how we are going to, I think this session will basically expand on these ideas. ADB is there for these countries to ensure that this whole process will accelerate to the point that it will be really effective to limit the global rising temperature to 1.5 degrees as we all would like to see. With that, I stop here. Preeti, I think that gives a good start to the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Priyanta, for setting the tone of the session and talking not only about beyond NDCs, but beyond carbon neutrality. That is a very important message on which we make a segue to our next speaker, who is Isabelle de l'Enfance, head of Southeast Asia COP26 strategy and based in Singapore. She has been very busy since 2020, taking the message of enhanced ambition for COP26. And we are just a few more months from the actual event. So Isabelle, over to you to raise the bar and ambition in this session.
Thank you very much, Preeti. And it's a really good follow-up from Priyanka's introduction. So thank you, Preeti, and I'm really honored and delighted to be joining this session today. So as Preeti said, I'm based in Singapore at the British High Commission, and I lead the work with the 10 ASEAN countries on the preparation for COP26 in November this year. So first, I just wanted to flag that the UK is taking this presidency in partnership with Italy at a critical but very challenging time that has been marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has actually delayed COP by 1 year, as you will all know. But this delay also offers an opportunity to maximize the synergies between the COVID recovery policies and the Paris Agreement goals and the NDCs. So the three pillars of the Paris Agreement that have been agreed, let me go back, that have been agreed universally in 2015 require more action, given the ambition, adaptation, and resilience and finance gap that we face at the moment. So these are clear challenges that we are facing. At COP26, we also need to finalize the rule book of the Paris Agreement and agree a balanced negotiation package on a number of topics like carbon markets, transparency, adaptation. And then finally, the public concern in many countries has significantly increased since Paris. So the world is watching more than ever what governments are going to do in Glasgow. So I won't go into the details of this, but just wanted to give you an overview of the 4 key goals that our COP26 President Alok Sharma has set out for COP26 in light of different pillars. So they really align with the pillars of Paris agreements. So it's about increasing mitigation efforts that goes through the NDCs and the long-term net zero strategies. Adaptation is really core to COP26, about increasing the support to vulnerable countries to adapt to the impact of climate change and make the infrastructure and agriculture more resilient. It's about mobilizing more public and private finance for climate action. And it's about accelerating the collaboration between governments and across society with flagship initiatives like the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience that have been launched by the UNFCCC. But let's talk more about the NDCs and what they are and why they do really matter. So the NDCs really emerged from the Paris Agreement in 2015, and they are a solution for each party to the agreement to publish and communicate externally their headline emission reduction to the Paris Agreement. So the NDCs are set out how the country will contribute to the global target of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep global mean temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to ideally limit these temperatures to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the NDCs are nationally set, so they're not mandatory and they're nationally set. So each country is responsible for setting their own targets. And that was part of the big consensual agreement at Paris, to basically recognizing that all parties have a role to play to reduce emission, but instead of centrally defining who contributes how much, each country sets their own target based on their national circumstances. So that's a very important pillar of the Paris Agreement. So NDCs can take various different forms, but they should all include clear emission reduction targets. But some of them also include climate adaptation targets and climate adaptation commitments. So if I look quickly at this slide, so in Paris in 2015, all countries agreed to update these NDCs and progressively increase them every 5 years. So that's what it's called the ratchet mechanism. So under this mechanism, every 5 years, there will be a stock take of where the NDCs lead us and how much more needs to be done. And therefore, all the SDCs are expected to be more and more ambitious each time. COP26 this year is the first significant test of the Paris Agreement, where the countries are expected to reassess their first NDCs and now made commitments that would be higher than in the past. So if I go back to the previous slide, so why does it matter so much? So NDCs are not only a tool for countries to develop and communicate their climate actions and their climate policies, but also a means to really embed them in their national economic planning, including in their COVID recovery plans. So they should really be seen as an opportunity for countries to work on their policies and embed them as a cross-government approach. They are also important because they send a clear signal of serious political intent to reduce the emission, and it provides political signals to other parties to the Paris Agreement who may be dragging their feet to actually raise their own ambition. So there's a bit of a peer pressure building up. It also finally provides a critical market signal for innovators, for investors, for industry, that the government's direction of travel is clear, and that provides market opportunities for them. Sadly, and Priyanka referred to the fact that the NDCs are not enough, because the analysis of the current NDC that have been submitted to date show that we are not on track to meet the temperature goals of the Paris, so these 2 degree and 1.5 degree targets. So the 2 degree target is the light green light, and the 1.5 degree target is the dark green line here. And it really shows that what it shows that the projection shows that the emissions will keep rising for the next decade, where they actually should be rapidly decreasing to meet the Paris Agreement. So that really shows the emission gap, the gap that we have to fill with the NDCs. So accelerating actions from the energy sector in Asia is particularly important and essential, because Asia is the largest and fastest growing region. It accounts for more than half of the global greenhouse gas emission. And it is an area under the most intense scrutiny to reduce emission, especially on coal-fired power generation. Priyanka referred to that. So the no more coal policy is really important to meet and fill this gap. And we have not enough signals at the moment from Asia with that regard. So really good and really positive signal from ADB to have these no more coal policies in the new energy policy, energy strategy. But recently there has been some positive announcements from the region that kind of brings hope. So Maldives has not only increased their headline reduction targets in their NDC, but they also set out a plan to achieve net zero by 2030. We have Laos that have included unconditional commitments of 60% reduction in the NDC, but also set an ambitious target to reach net zero by 2050. We have Philippines, who have announced a moratorium on coal. We have Pakistan, who is engaging on cross-government process on their coal moratorium. Bangladesh is also cancelling a number of coal power plants and engaging further on the NDC. And then on the net zero targets, we've had announcement from China to commit to net zero by 2016, Japan and South Korea to commit to net zero by 2050. So there is hope and there are positive signals coming from the region. Now, let me share a little bit about the lessons from the UK experience in updating the NDC and the key considerations. So the key considerations behind the NDCs are really to, as I said, increase progressively the targets. That's the ratchet mechanism I mentioned. But it's also about setting a target that is ambitious but fair and compatible with domestic policies. And also improve, not only, the NDC is not about the target, it's also about improve the robustness and the comprehensiveness of the NDC by having an economy-wide approach. So make sure that you cover all the sectors of the economy, and also use the latest accounting methodologies. Methodologies for accounting for greenhouse gas emission keep evolving, and being inclusive in your process of setting the NDC. These are really important considerations in NDC preparation. So setting ambitions target, as I said before, they also send clear signals to the investors, and that's why the inclusivity in the process of the NDC is so important. So I won't labor too much on this slide. This is just to send the key message from the UK is that it is possible to reduce emission while growing the economy. And that's what the UK is not the only country that has achieved that, this green growth. And they have achieved that over the last 30 years. So it is possible to achieve this green growth of uncoupling greenhouse gas emission and economic growth. Again, I'm not going to labor on this slide. It's about key facts that show that the energy transition is now a global trend, and the rapidly declining costs of new technologies actually call for regular updates on the NDCs, because the assumptions, the data you would base your NDC a couple of years ago would have changed. So updating the NDCs is actually really important. And then my final message is really about the fact that the NDC is not only useful as a policy exercise for the governments, but also an opportunity to create a whole of government approach, because it's a true climate change and it's a truly cross-cutting issue that cannot be resolved by one minister alone. It's also an opportunity to create a political and regulatory framework that is needed to drive clean investments, and finally demonstrate international leadership. So I'm looking forward to discussion in this session and hearing about your experience on NDCs. Thank you, Preeti.
Thank you, Isabel. Thanks a lot for providing us with the overview of the COP26 incoming presidency's aspirations for the COP, but also, what UK has committed to and how it is showing that it is economically compatible also to show ambition on climate. So with these two excellent overview presentations by Priyanta and Isabel, let's dive a little deeper into actions that are taking place in Vietnam, Indonesia, and India to get a flavor of what is happening in these countries vis-a-vis the transitions that are required as indicated or signaled in their NDCs. So our first presenter in this session is Ms. Nguyen Nau, Executive Director of the Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transitions. And she will be talking about NDC roadmap in Vietnam and the future of energy transition. So over to you, Ms. Nguyen.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Am I online? Hello. Okay. Absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to distinctive panelists and participants to today's session. My name is An Hai. My role today is to deliver the presentation on the future of energy transition in Vietnam on behalf of Ms. Ngo Tu Nguyen, our Executive Director, who unfortunately cannot be here today due to her family emergency. So we are from the Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transition, an independent think tank based in Hanoi, specialized in energy and climate protection. Our mission is to accelerate the energy transition of Vietnam toward a neutral carbon society in a sustainable and reliable manner. Our presentation today will give an overview of the energy transition in Vietnam in the context of climate constraints. The first content is the drivers for energy transition in our country. The second part will take a closer look to the renewable energy development in Vietnam. And finally, a brief on the challenges and opportunities for more NDC ambitious goals. So Vietnam has internal and external drivers for the energy transition. The first one is the fast-growing energy demand driven by urbanization and industrialization of the economy, as shown by the historical data on energy consumption per capita. Meeting such rising demand requires the exploitation of more diverse energy sources, in which renewable energy plays an increasingly important role. The second driver is from insufficient domestic fossil fuel supply. Vietnam has turned from net coal exporter to importer since 2015, with fast-growing imported volume. This urges the country to turn to available domestic resources like wind and solar. The reduction in renewable energy costs has driven the energy transition worldwide, and Vietnam is not an exception. Vietnam has committed to join the international effort in cutting emissions by signing the Paris Agreement in 2016 and was one of the first countries to complete and submit the updated NDC in July 2020. In the updated NDC, Vietnam commits to reduce 9% of greenhouse gas compared to business as usual scenario with domestic resources and 25%, 27% with international supports. This graph shows the breakdown of the historical greenhouse gas emission in 2014 and the projected emission in the BAU on the left-hand side, the minus scenario, 9 scenario in the middle graph, and the minus 27 scenario on the right-hand side. The total greenhouse gas emission in 2030 in the BAU is projected to be more than three-fold of the emission level in 2014. Emission per capita of Vietnam in 2014 was just 1.8 tons of CO2, lower than the world average of 4.7. However, the projected emission in the BAU means that emission per capita of Vietnam will rise to about 9 tons of CO2 per capita, implying a fast economic growth and industrialization. The breakdown showed that by 2030, the contribution of energy activities in total greenhouse gas emission will be dominant. So the graph here shows the first column indicate the share of power sector contribution in 2030, which is about half of total emission of the BAU scenario, making the sector the largest CO2 emitter. Adding other energy activities such as transportation, manufacturing and construction, residential and commercial services, the energy sector would account for 73% of total emission. There are, however, some points that worth noting in the development of the BAU scenario for the NDC. Firstly, the BAU updated NDC is based on the Power Development Plan 7 revised, which is issued by the government since 2016, in which only a moderate capacity of renewable energy is planned for 2030, 12 gigawatt of solar and 6 gigawatt of wind power out of 130 gigawatt, only about 14%. Moreover, in the BAU, the CO2 emission from power sector is calculated with an assumption that the renewable energy capacity and the energy efficiency measures as in the PDP-7 revised are excluded. When the NDC was completed in July 2020, the next power development plan, so-called the PDP-8, was being developed, and the first published draft was only available in February 2021. Because the NDC based on the PDP-7 revised, there are differences in the CO2 emission projection between NDC and PDP-8. This graph dives in the projected CO2 emission on the power sector in the BAU scenario of NDC, the BAU scenario of PDP-8, and the selected scenario of PDP-8. The big difference between NDC and PDP-8 scenario is due to the penetration of renewable energy in the power mix. As mentioned earlier, the NDC's BAU has no renewable energy capacity, while in the draft PDP-8, the BAU projected a significant share of renewable energy in the power mix. 46% include hydros and 33% exclude hydro. The current situation of the power sector in Vietnam is that the share of the grid-connected non-hydro renewables has reached 16% of the power mix, with a total installed capacity of 9.7 gigawatt, with mostly from solar farms, more than 9 gigawatt. In addition, the distributed renewable energy, the rooftop solar capacity, was about more than 7 gigawatt at the end of 2020. Compared to the renewable energy target of the PDP-7 revised, 12 gigawatt of solar and 6 gigawatt of wind, the installed capacity of solar by 2020 has already exceeded the PDP-7 target for 2030. It is also estimated based on the current wind project pipelines that by the end of 2021, about 6 to 8 gigawatts of wind could be commissioned, making the target even more outdated. Thanks to the feed-in tariff scheme, renewable energy has developed rapidly in the last 3 years in Vietnam, especially for solar. Within the first 6 months in 2019, about 90 solar farm projects has been completed, adding nearly 5 gigawatts of installed capacity to the power system. By the end of 2020, renewable capacity is almost doubled. Building wind farms take longer and require more technical know-how, yet wind power development is getting in momentum, with 6 to 8 gigawatts to be added to the power system by the end of 2021. Such development indicates that Vietnam is quickly catching up with the global trend of energy transition toward a neutral carbon vision. As a think tank specialized in conducting research in energy transition and climate protection, we strongly believe that Vietnam can set high ambition goals for greenhouse gas emission reduction. And to provide scientific evidence for that, our think tank is working on long-term energy transition support with the studies that investigate the possibility of raising emission targets, along with sustainable increasing of renewable energy integration. The development of the scenario will be focusing on 3 different scenarios. The new BAU scenario based on the Power Development Plan 8. The second scenario is based on the goal to reduce 30% of greenhouse gas emission through reducing the use of coal, higher energy efficiency, higher renewable share in the power mix, and higher penetration of electricity vehicles. And the third scenario aims to cut emission by 50% by phasing out old inefficient coal power plants, increasing energy efficiency, renewable energy, electricity vehicle, and deploy demand-side management solutions in all sectors. So more ambitious goals have high potentials, and we believe that the energy transition case of Vietnam could be a role model to decision in other countries that will bring great contribution to the global effort of keeping temperature below 1.5. However, we can also see that Vietnam is facing big challenges on financing the energy transition process, especially in the context of new normal economic conditions after the COVID-19 pandemic. So we hope that together with the domestic resources and the international support, we can successfully implementing the energy transition in Vietnam toward the neutral carbon and could be like negative carbon emission in the future. So that would be the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anna, and thank you for stepping in on behalf of your executive director. And we really appreciate your coming in at the last minute to make this very interesting presentation on the energy transition that is already taking place in Vietnam, and the optimistic scenario that you have presented through the eighth power development plan, and the penetration of renewables that is taking place, and also the different scenarios that you're talking about, be it related to 30% reduction in emissions or 50% reduction in emissions, and very clearly outlined options to achieve that. If I could ask you a question, and you did allude to it, at the end of your presentation, that these different scenarios or ambitions would require financing this transition. And I wanted to ask you, what is the scale of investment required for this transition? And what is the discussion taking place in Vietnam on mobilizing such investments? So if you could respond to that, please.
Thank you for your questions. So as energy transition is a process that needs to happen in all sectors, including the power sector, transportation, industry, residential, commerce, and even in agriculture. So to drive the shift in Vietnam, it is obvious that a huge amount of investment would be required, and the scale of investment is in the magnitude of hundreds of billions to trillions US dollar. Just take an example. To realize the draft PDP8 selected scenarios, the investment required for power development up to 2030 is estimated at 128 billion US dollar, in which about 95 billions is for power source development and 33 billions for grid development. And for the period up to 2045, the total investment required for the power sector alone estimated about 200 billions US dollar. So these numbers not yet include the financing for phasing out coal or implementing the energy efficiency measures. The Vietnam National Energy Efficiency Program estimated the investment required for energy efficiency measures at about 190 billion US dollar. Other sectors also require significant investment for the energy transition, such as infrastructure for higher penetration of electricity vehicles, and also decarbonizing the industry. So given such scale, it is clear that the limited public budget will not be enough, especially when the funds are also used to address other economic and societal challenges. Therefore, to meet the investment requirement, aside from mobilizing the financial resources from private sectors, such as the companies, institutions, the banks, international support will be crucial for Vietnam to implement the energy transition and to realize and contribute to the global effort of climate protection.
Thank you. Thank you for your very comprehensive response, highlighting the scale of investments that would be required and the need to mobilize the private sector and other actors beyond, the public investments that would enable this transition. Let us move on to the next presentation now from Indonesia. And it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Ms. Kamia Handiani, who is the Manager of Climate Change at PLN. She will be talking about achieving the Indonesian NDCs. And in that context, what is the role of the power sector? Over to you, Kamia.
Thank you very much, Preeti. Good afternoon from Jakarta, everyone. So first of all, allow me to introduce you first to PLN. So PLN is a state-owned electricity company. Its activity involves generations, transmissions, distributions, and also direct electricity sales to the customers. Indonesia has also ratified the Paris Agreement, same as Vietnam, also in 2016, and have submitted the nationally determined contributions. And the target is to reduce emissions by 29% in 2030. And 11% of this 29% should be coming from the energy sector. And if we look closely to the power sector, the power sector is targeted to contribute 53% of the energy sector target. So according to the Power Development Plan of 2019-2028, we call it RUPTL, which also follow the National Energy Policy Mandate aligned with the Indonesian NDC to increase the energy mix, to increase the renewable energy mix up to 23% by 2025 and then 31% by 2050. And also other GIG measures written in the PDP is to increase energy efficiency and also to convert, to do the fuel switching, converting oil to biofuel or gas, which has lower emissions than coal or oil. So according to the projection from the PDP, by doing those measures, there will be reductions in emission intensity from the business as usual by 2028 from 0.945 ton per megawatt hour will become 0.7 ton per megawatt hour. And in absolute term, it will reduce around 137 million tons of CO2 emission compared to business as usual by 2028. As a company, the major electricity company in Indonesia, PLN, follows the national commitment. So, but first of all, we have to see, or we have to know where we are standing. So to do that, we have to calculate our emission footprint as the baseline of where we are. So what the PLN does is calculating the emissions, Scope 1 emission, which is the direct emission from the power plant, and also Scope 2 and 3 emissions, and report the emission into the our sustainability report. And also, as mentioned earlier, we also simulate the power projection of emission for the next 10 years. According with the power development plan. So now we already know our baseline of our emissions. So what we do to mitigate the climate change? The first one is to increase the renewable capacity. We have the PLN's Green Transformation Program, which is to increase the renewable capacity from 7.8 gigawatts in 2019 to 19.9 gigawatt by 2025. There are some initiatives to implement this short-term or mid-term target to increase renewable energy. We implement the corporate strategic planning, and then we add from this strategic corporate planning with the large-scale renewable and also green boosters, which include replacing diesel with renewables, biomass co-firing, utilizing X mining for solar PV, and also operating floating solar PV. We also expecting the presidential regulations on carbon pricing. So based on the draft in December 2020, there are 3 mechanisms that will be included in this regulation, which is carbon tax, carbon trading, and also result-based payment. But for the energy sector itself, the Ministry of Energy has launched the pilot phase of the national emission trading for the power sector. So there are it covers coal power plants with 100 megawatts capacity and above. So the intentions of national emission trading is to reduce emissions from the existing coal power plants, and thus contributes to the achievement of Indonesian NDCs. So under this carbon trading, there is an option to, there are 3 options. Of course, the first one has to reduce the emissions from its power plant by increasing energy efficiency. But there is also an option to do the carbon offsetting and also emission trading with a certain amount from the total target of emission reductions. So so that's why there are also the development of a clean energy project through CDM and also voluntary verified carbon standard, or VCS. And it makes possible for the power plant to offset their emissions in addition to their reducing emission from their own actions. So, for example, here one of the power plant purchased carbon credit from renewable energy, and this will help the development of renewable energy further in the future. And carbon offset can also be done by activities. In this slide, it shows the, for example, on the right hand is the certificate of one of the production house, which doing the carbon offset for an activity for making advertising movie. So this also possible to be done, and it also helps at the end incentivize the renewable energy development. And another market-based instrument that is also developed by PLN is renewable energy certificate. So this is the market-based instrument that represents the property right of environmental benefit of renewable energy generations. It helps companies to achieve renewable energy targets transparently while supporting the development of renewable energy in Indonesia. It's quite different with a carbon credit because in REC, the product is the megawatt hour of renewable energy productions, but with the carbon credit, the product is the ton of CO2 emission that being reduced by a renewable energy project. And the development of renewable energy certificate is doing together with the APX Tigers, which provides a tracking system for REC issuance, and it's the entire process are verified and compliant with the RE100 best practices guidelines and also CDP standards. So to summarize, the GHG mitigations in PLN includes the first one, see our baseline, which is by doing the GHG emission inventory. And the second one, increase the renewable capacity, and then improvement of energy efficiency. And we also utilize the carbon pricing mechanism to support us in incentivize the development of renewable energy. And this intensifies the development of fossil fuel power plant. But also, it is also important to develop corporate policy. So currently, we are finalizing the BOD directive on climate change, and also to keep a partnership with all of our stakeholders, increase awareness. And it's also important to mitigate the risk of climate change itself, because the focus of the to the power sector has been on mitigating climate change. But actually, the climate change is also affected the power sector. We have experienced this. For example, last April, we have the first cyclone, tropical cyclone in Nusa Tenggara Timur in NTT, which have caused the widespread outages, and it took several days for PLN to recover the destruction from this disaster. So it means that the power sector needs to also mitigate the risk of climate change, which is already happening. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. I over to you, Preti. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamya, for this very lucid presentation, and thank you also for highlighting the role of carbon pricing and how Indonesia is pursuing carbon pricing in different forms and options. So my question to you is, you talked about the national emission trading scheme that is being piloted now. So what is the allocation mechanisms for emissions to the power plants? And what are the underlying pricing assumptions also to mitigate emissions at the lowest cost possible? So would be interested in knowing from you on these aspects of your emissions trading scheme.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, this is actually also quite new for us to participate in the carbon trade. I mean the emission trading. So the allowance for the allowance given to the coal power plant is based on the emission cap. So the government first, the Ministry of Energy first determine the cap of emission for different type of different group of coal power plant. It's differentiated based on size. So the cap is in terms of emission intensity. So it is in ton per megawatt hour. But then it can be converted into the absolute emission. So every year, so for example, in this year in 2021, power plant have already made inventory on their emissions, right? So they compare this inventory, the result of this inventory, with the allowance. The allowance is basically based on the productions of electricity multiplied with the emission cap. So then they will get this allowance. So if they have this allowance, they have at the end they have the balance. They still have allowance. Then it's fine. But if at the end they already increase the allowance, then they have to do something. For example, they can do the trading with other power plant unit, or they can also do the offsetting. And regarding the price, So I think because this is the first one, this is the pilot phase, the government also determine like the floor price, the minimum price for this mechanism. So the price for emission trading is in the level of between two $2 per ton to 10 US dollar per ton, and if for the offsetting, for the carbon offsetting, it's from 0.2 US dollar per ton to 20 USD per ton. So that's the current price. So if we have if we do the trading or offsetting like outside this price, then it cannot be accounted in this emission trading mechanism. I hope it answers your question.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that response. And before I turn on to the next speaker, may I request the audience, if you are, thinking of some questions to pose to our speakers until now, please start posting your questions so that we can pick it up in the discussion session. I know we have 3 more speakers to go, and without, limiting their interventions, I would request them to keep to the 7-minute limit that we had agreed to. So let me now move on to the next speaker, who is Mr. Ratin Kukreja. He's manager from ICF Consulting India, and he will be talking about the role of green hydrogen in achieving NDC targets. So over to you, Ratin, for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Preeti, and hello to everyone. I'm Ratin Kukreja, and I lead the Energy Efficiency and Climate Change Division at ICF India office. ICF is a global consulting firm with presence across more than 70 countries and proactively working to help solve challenging problems related to energy efficiency and climate change. Very delighted to be here and would like to thank Asia Clean Energy Forum for giving me this opportunity to present my views on this platform in front of this large and knowledgeable audience. To begin with, my presentation today will revolve around why we need to focus upon hydrogen, why it is still a challenge, and conclude with a way forward so as to make hydrogen economy viable and competitive with respect to the Indian context. So beginning with my presentation, as many of us could know, hydrogen is a very versatile fuel that finds application in almost all the sectors, transport, industry, power, buildings. So the question now arises is why we are focusing on it today, given the fact that it has such wide applications and has been in existence for so long. Well, the main reason has been the rapid cost reduction in renewable power, which is the need for clean hydrogen production that has happened in last few years, as well as the performance of the electrolyzers over the years has considerably improved. Plus, there is also an increasingly growing concern on climate change and net zero like never before. So all these reasons are coupled and have forced us to think about the one and only solution, which is now hydrogen. Hydrogen's role also becomes important is because hydrogen is capable of decarbonizing hard to abate sectors like transportation and especially the industrial sector, such as iron and steel, fertilizers, ammonia, where processes cannot be electrified. So we basically now have a solution in the name of hydrogen that can decarbonize these sectors. And that's why hydrogen is now getting a lot more attention as compared to the earlier years. So the biggest challenge that is stopping us from adoption of this clean fuel is the higher production costs. Currently, fossil fuel-based hydrogen, which is known as the gray hydrogen, can be delivered with less than $1.5 per kg, while production with carbon capture route, which is known as blue hydrogen, can further add 20% to this cost. Green hydrogen currently is delivered at approximately $5 per kg, though these estimates are now currently dropping sharply with advances in electrolyzer technologies and oversupply of renewable power, and expected to reach costs of around $2.6 per kg by 2030. So higher costs as well as lack of carbon pricing has limited its demand across the end-use sectors where hydrogen can actually be more impactful. So without this demand pull, investment into new production capacities and new avenues for transportation and storage infrastructure won't look justifiable. So it's important to create this demand pull in sectors where it can be used to decarbonize. So let's look at the total cost of hydrogen in terms of TCO, total cost of ownership. So as we can see here that for non-transport applications, hydrogen production cost is an important element and comprises of 70% of total cost of ownership. But this is not the case with transport applications where the fuel cost accounts only for 40% of total cost of ownership. So this means in order for hydrogen to become competitive in transport sector, we would need a reduction not only in hydrogen production cost, but also an equal reduction would be needed in fuel cell capital cost as well as the fuel tank costs. So it's very clear that cost reduction for transport sector is not going to happen only with reduction in hydrogen production, but it will be largely driven from manufacturing scale up of end user equipments. So now moving to the India scenario. So India, as we know, is the world's third largest emitter in the world behind USA and China, but produces less than 10% of world's hydrogen, and almost all of which is produced via the grey route, with the industrial sector being the major consumer. Though India does hold a competitive advantage to help launch this green hydrogen economy, which includes availability of cheap renewable energy, large energy imports of oil and natural gas, which the government is already aiming to reduce, and significant requirement for new industrial capacity in the coming years, which can potentially provide a huge market for hydrogen technologies. So these are the three factors which would be driving India's growth toward hydrogen economy in next future years. It is also expected that hydrogen can reduce India's emission to the extent of 20%, and it can help in achieving the NDC targets as well as India's emissions target of 450 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. So hydrogen has a very important role to play in industrial decarbonization. And as I mentioned earlier, in these hard to abate decarbonized sectors, electrifying processes is not a viable solution due to very high process temperature heat. As of now in India, only 18% of energy consumption in industries is electrified, and the rest would need some form of decarbonization. Sectors such as fertilizers, refineries, iron and steels, they are likely to drive the future demand for hydrogen market. And unlike the transport sector where hydrogen is fed to fuel cell to produce electricity, industrial use of hydrogen involves direct use of hydrogen as a feedstock. So decarbonization in industries via hydrogen can happen a lot quicker as fuel cell circuit is not involved. And as I mentioned earlier, it will help in reducing India's energy imports, which currently are around 160 billion US. So a lot to achieve in terms of hydrogen for India. Moving now to storage and transportation. So hydrogen as a fuel can go a long way in providing energy security to India. Through integration with renewable energy, it can be stored for as long as needed and then used via fuel cells back into electricity. In this way, longer periods or flaws of the solar and wind energy can be addressed. Hydrogen is perhaps the first viable option for seasonal energy storage. But the key challenge here is that renewable energy locations favorable for hydrogen production are far away from the potential demand centers in India. So then comes the need for transportation, and transportation from wind and solar locations to these demand centers will involve laying down of costly large-scale pipelines. To some extent, and in limited cases, we can certainly use the existing gas pipelines with suitable hydrogen blending, but overall a significant transportation infrastructure would be needed. Besides transportation, availability of storage space also plays a very critical role in hydrogen economy. While geological storage is the focus in other countries like the European Union and Australia, India is yet to carry out an extensive analysis to map the prospective sites for storing hydrogen. Hydrogen can generally be stored at high pressure, which again needs significant infrastructure such as compressors, tanks, as well as energy is needed in both liquefaction as well as compression. So lack of low-cost storage solutions can become a potential barrier, not only for green hydrogen, but also for blue hydrogen, which is done through the CCS route, carbon capture and storage. So here's a quick SWOT analysis of India's energy sector in hydrogen context. When we talk about India's strength, India has a strong private and public sector, having large companies capable of making investments on workable technologies and also compete globally. On weaknesses, the biggest one right now is the lack of a clear roadmap and policy to foster hydrogen in targeted sector, and less policy support and investment towards R&D, research and development. So this actually throws up the opportunity to collaborate globally through technology transfer from the developed world. And as I said, there's a huge potential for hydrogen in India in terms of energy security. So a lot of work still remains to be done. And as for threats, hydrogen will continue to receive heavy competition from other renewable routes, which are increasingly becoming more and more competitive. For example, solar and, for example, wind. So how can we move forward now? Well, here are the 7 key actionable points that I have listed in this slide. The first recommendation is to develop a comprehensive vision and blueprint for a hydrogen economy, which can actually go a long way in improving the energy security for a developing country like India. Though the hydrogen energy mission was launched in India in the union budget this year, but we are yet to see a release of a policy. It is equally important to create a hydrogen investment fund and a deeper carbon finance market so that hydrogen technologies can be scaled up and deployed. It is also very important to commit a share of hydrogen in India's energy mix. Right now, we don't have any set targets as to by this state we will have this much hydrogen as percentage of energy mix. So it's important to commit a share of target in India's energy mix. It is also very critical to demonstrate pilot projects for hydrogen technologies so as to reduce the uncertainty in market demand, which is necessary for large-scale deployment and cost reduction. Fifth, for cost reduction to happen, it is also important to encourage domestic manufacturing of electrolyzers in India. It is here that private sector again can play an important role. At present, most of the electrolyzers deployed in India are being imported from other countries like Japan, Germany, and Norway. So this is again an opportunity for the domestic markets to step in. Sixth, create public-private partnerships and task force to meet roadmap milestones and implementation path. And finally, India should continue to expand renewable energy, both solar and wind, and try to maximize the plant load factor. So that was a brief about green hydrogen economy. Thanks everyone for hearing me out patiently. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ratin. You mentioned in your presentation that, there is no clear policy and roadmap as yet, but, there must be a community discussing this option of hydrogen in the country. From your vantage point, what are you hearing about the future of hydrogen in India in terms of which path or which option would be preferred, green versus gray? And also, where do you see the challenges in pursuing this path?
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. Well, the preference certainly is for green hydrogen at the earliest feasible. I would actually see this as an opportunity than a challenge because it can help cut the import bill as well as to decarbonize the hard to abate sectors. The first challenge is obviously the lack of clear roadmap or policy. As I said earlier, India did launch a national hydrogen energy mission this year, but we are yet to see policy release, though a lot of agencies and task force have been formed. But a clear roadmap with set targets of allocation of hydrogen in energy mix is what is needed. Second challenge is higher cost of green hydrogen production, as I highlighted earlier. So there is basically a need to create a demand pull to commercialization and large-scale deployment of hydrogen technologies. This will help in reducing the costs. The third challenge, I would say, is the renewable energy locations. So the renewable energy locations favorable for hydrogen production are far away from potential demand centers. So this would again need a considerable infrastructure to be set up for transportation and storage. So basically, in a nutshell, have a clear roadmap, create a demand pool. This would lead to investments and creation of infrastructure, which would ultimately lead to large-scale deployment, leading to lower hydrogen production costs and thus enable this transition. So this is like a brief approach towards this transition.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights on this subject. And this brings us to the end of our presentation session, but we have two panelists who will respond either to the presentations they've heard or, from their very unique perspective based on the work that they are currently undertaking. So let me move on to the first panelist, which is Utsav Adhikari. He's the Vice President for Delphos International Limited in the United States of America. And I understand he's going to talk a little about making renewable energy subsidies more sustainable, but any other observations that you may have, Utsav, on the presentations made would also be very, very welcome. So over to you.
Thank you, Preeti. And thank you to all the presenters and speakers today. I will try to weave in some observations from the presentations as I speak today. But I work at Delphos International, which is a financial advisory firm that specializes in raising concessional capital for projects and companies in emerging markets around the world. And so my response or my discussion of subsidies will be colored by my work at Delphos and my background, which is in renewable energy finance and power markets. And so I will focus particularly on subsidies in the context of offtake contracts for utility scale, private sector or IPP power projects. And the key tenet of project financing here really is bankability, which can cover a whole number of different provisions. But the most basic idea is that the project should have subsidized or stable contracted revenue streams on the basis of which it can go to banks and raise debt financing. So from the perspective of an individual project, you want the contract to be relatively simple, and you want the contract price to be high enough that you can cover the costs and deliver the necessary returns. This is why feed-in tariffs are very popular instruments to jumpstart a new industry like solar PV or wind. And when set at sufficiently high levels, they've proven to be very effective at doing so around the world. The challenge is when you think of an entire sector rather than individual projects. So as the renewable energy industry scales up, or as the projects themselves get larger, like you might get with offshore wind especially, continued reliance on feed-in tariffs can be a financial burden on the utility. And to support project viability, you really do need these off-takers to be financially sound. And these contracts are long-term, 15 to 20 years or 25 years typically. And so there is the risk of the utility seeking to renegotiate these contracts when they run into financial difficulty. And with unexpected crises like COVID or, as Kamya mentioned earlier, more frequent and more severe climate-related natural disasters, that is more likely than, more likely than we may have thought a few years ago. And so this sort of PPA repricing risk is higher for initial vintage of projects of a new technology in a country. So for example, we've seen how fast prices have been dropping for solar PV in competitive tenders around the world. The downside of that is utilities are now starting to look at contracts they signed 5 years ago and complain that, oh, they're too high and it's a burden on them, and trying to renegotiate them. Of course, this ignores the very different risk and cost profile of a solar PV project, even in 2019 compared to the present. But once this type of conversation starts in a particular market, then it can create bankability issues for current projects of all technologies. And so renewable energy credits and carbon pricing, they can be a market-based mechanism to help get away from this reliance on feed-in tariffs. So, but sometimes the bankability challenge with those is that there's not always enough long-term buyers for those credits to provide that long-term contracted revenue stream. And so lenders might end up discounting such revenues when they size debt. And as the market for those environmental credits and environmental commodities mature and become more liquid, and as lenders become more familiar with those contracts and how the prices are going to move for a carbon offset or a renewable energy credit, then they can be a very effective instrument. So depending on the country and technology, they may not always be sufficient at present to bridge that funding gap right away, but they should be developed for long-term goals. But but offtake contracts that rely on sort of a contracts for differences approach can really be effective way to subsidize PPAs without directly straining the utility's financial resources. So using a modified approach, you can split the responsibility for the contract price between the utility and a government-backed fund. The reference price would be the cost of power that the utility faces in securing its power supply, whether through its own means or through power purchase from other independent producers, or in markets with wholesale electricity markets through the reference spot prices. And so the government would then pay the difference, or the fund would pay the difference, and essentially the utilities' finances are not directly impacted, so they remain a viable creditworthy counterparty, which further reduces costs of procuring capacity in the future. And depending on the government's objectives, there are different ways to set up the CFD mechanism, the contract for differences mechanism, that either reduce the burden to the government over time, or achieve different transition goals across different sectors, incorporate carbon pricing or renewable energy credits. And you can also set up the funding scheme in different ways. So for the government-backed fund, so that you can replenish it to continually support future decarbonization. One example might be through excise taxes on coal generation in the future. But it's not all the different countries are at different stages of unbundling and implementing electricity markets. But it's important to start exploring such market-based mechanisms because, as mentioned earlier by Anne, we've only just started on the pathways on the decarbonization pathway, and there will be newer technologies in the market in the future, including one candidate technology we just heard about. And so, given the scale of investments required, it's important to ensure that the key actors and partners of the power sector remain strong financially, because this can really have significant knock-on effects on how effectively we are able to mobilize private sector finance to support this transition. Hopefully that answers or addresses some of the questions, and also ties in with the presentations earlier.
Sure. No, thank you. Thanks for bringing the bankability of projects, a very important issue, to the fore. You're talking about the nuts and bolts of implementing some of these ambitions, and bankability is, of course, very, very important. And also the new mechanism that you're talking about, the contract for differences mechanism, seems an exciting idea at the national level. But you have very rightly pointed out, it depends on the stage of development of a country, and what are the different options they are pursuing. So the government-backed funds, of course, begs the question of government's ability to also undertake such financing, such different, financing for those differences. But it's an important idea, and I'm sure, it will be taken up in the rest of the week also in terms of financing these transitions. So thank you for your intervention, Utsav. And let me now move to John Byrne. He is a research fellow with the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. And John, we'd love to hear your observations on what can be done more to mobilize private investments, recognizing that bankability is an issue, as Utsav pointed out. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Priti. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And can you see my slides? Is the screen being shared?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so sorry? Full screen, okay. New full screen. Sorry about this. Okay, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is John Byrne. I'm a research fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. And I would like to structure my comments around three main issues. So one on the drivers of investment in renewable energy, private investment in renewable energy. I would then like to link this somewhat to the targets that we have in place with the NDCs, and then look at the broader picture. So how this relates to the macro environment. And I will draw some parallels to the discussions that we had earlier in the cases of Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, which are obviously climate vulnerable countries, and that will lead into the macro discussion that I will come to at the end. So first of all, I think it's important to have a look at the bigger picture. So on the left-hand panel, we can see the level of investment in renewable energy in Asia and Pacific over time. And what we can see is essentially a leveling off since the last few years. And this is related to, high initial capital costs, as well as continued subsidized costing for electricity and fossil fuels. And this, of course, is the purpose of having these targets in place. On the right-hand panel, I refer to some recent research that I've carried out with co-authors on the drivers of private investment in renewable energy. And what we can see from this analysis is that government expenditure in R&D remains key, as well as feed-in tariffs. There are other important aspects related to technology costs, which are perhaps a little bit less important in the Asia Pacific case because the region is already very cost competitive in this area. But the finding that government expenditure and feed-in tariffs are key drivers of private investment is an important finding. And this will lead to my later discussion on the impact that sovereign risk has on the level of investment that can be gleaned from the public sector. Before I go to that, let's take a look at the targets that are in place in the Asia Pacific region. We learned a lot earlier in the discussion from the presentations, but it remains the case that Asia remains at the bottom of the pile in terms of its share of quantified targets in the NDC. So this is something that needs to be addressed, and this, I think, would help to stimulate a rising level of renewable energy investment. Of course, one can always argue about the realistic nature of the targets and how feasible they may be, but I think that having quantifiable targets in place is something that's important. We learned today already that there are improvements being made largely on a continual basis. But I think more work needs to be done for the Asia region at the global level. Now, coming back and trying to draw a link with the macro position relative to our findings about the drivers of private investment in renewable energy, it's quite clear that, particularly since the pandemic, that public finances are under considerable strain, number one. Number two, rising vulnerability to climate change will have an increasing strain on sovereign bond yields, an increase in the price of sovereign risk. So the natural implication of this is that it will be a hindrance towards the level of government expenditure that will be available for other types of expenditure, such as renewable energy. So it's important for economies, particularly those that are vulnerable to climate change, to manage the risks from climate change on their fiscal expenditure side. So in other words, how to manage climate-related sovereign risks will be a key factor driving the extent to which economies can improve their investment or improve the attractiveness of investment in R&D, or sorry, in renewable energy for private purposes. Now, this very brief presentation attempts to draw the links between all of these different dynamics. So on the one hand, we have the public sector driving investment in R&D through government expenditure in R&D, as well as through feed-in tariffs. On the other hand, we have a rising vulnerability to climate change, having an increasing effect on sovereign bond yields, therefore squeezing the public finances. So the kind of broad message that's being made here is that public debt sustainability is actually one of the key points important to achieving the NDC targets. And this is a point that's often overlooked, particularly in the public sector. I think this link between climate change and sovereign risk is something that's going to impede the level of government expenditure that's available more broadly, not only for renewable energy purposes. So governments really need to understand how to manage these climate-related sovereign risks, and there are a number of ways that that can be done. 5 points are given on the slide. I won't go into detail on them all, given the time, but naturally it's of key importance to understand the scale of the vulnerability to climate change. It's important to mainstream climate risk analysis into public financial management, adjust monetary and financial frameworks appropriately, and importantly, number 4, it's crucial to implement financial sector policies to scale up adaptation and resilience, and also develop insurance solutions. And one of the ways that that can be done is through, continued improvements and development in local currency bond markets, including through fintech solutions. But at the end of the day, for very climate vulnerable economies, there may be a need for international support in order to mitigate these risks. And when these risks are mitigated appropriately, this of course relieves pressure on the public finances, reduces the cost of sovereign borrowing, and then this can help to stimulate a rise in the possibility for increased levels of government expenditure in R&D, feed-in tariffs over the longer term, and therefore help to create space for private investment in renewable energy. So that's my brief remarks today. So thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for bringing a very unique perspective on managing climate-related sovereign risk. This is a discourse that is gaining ground now, and you have linked it very, very succinctly to the costs of borrowing and to the cost of doing business and enabling transitions, and a very, very important perspective that we have to bear in mind moving forward, especially looking at debt sustainability as well. So thank you for that very unique perspective. I understand we have just 4 minutes left to wrap up this session, and I have received a few questions. They are mainly to Anha from Vietnam and to Ratin from ICF Consulting. So let me start with Anna, and I'll request the presenters to be as succinct as they can. Anha, the question to you is that, can you highlight 2 key challenges for Vietnam to roll out its energy transition?
Okay, thank you for the questions. And from our perspective, aside from the financings, it's situation that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. The industrialization in Vietnam, particularly in the power sector, as the power sector is currently the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emission. So for the renewable energy development, one of the key points in Vietnam is the integration, the ability for the integration of renewable energy, and to while still maintaining the reliability of the grid and the power system. In the context that we have more and more renewable energy, variable renewable energy like wind and solar connected to the grid.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for that response. Ratin, there are two questions to you. The first one relates to a clarification. What do you mean by total cost of ownership? So if you can provide an explanation to that. And the second one is your view on, can India build a global scale green hydrogen industry, and to what extent will it help it enhance its climate ambition? So two questions, one clarificatory and one your take on the future of green hydrogen in India.
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. So answering the first question as to total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership is basically defined as the cost of an asset over the entire lifetime. So when I say that for transport sector, the total cost of ownership is 40% for fuel. Am I audible? Am I audible, Preeti? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, Ratin.
Yes. So to answer the first question on the...
So there's just a holding slide up at the moment. So if you just wait, we put a holding slide up because there was a dropout and it messed up everyone's images.
Okay.
I thought it was live streaming or not.
also on the viability for India to do large-scale green hydrogen. What is your take on it? But since we are already 5 minutes over time, request you to be very, very quick.
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. So total cost of ownership, it is basically defined as the total cost incurred over the lifetime in owning and using an asset. So when I say that for transport sector, the total cost of ownership is 40% for fuel, it means the 40% of the total cost will come from hydrogen as a fuel, and rest 60% is on account of equipment cost. That is purchase of other equipment costs such as fuel tanks, fuel cells, and membrane costs. So when we say 40%, it means 40% is the fuel cost and remaining is the equipment cost. So this is an answer to TCO. And the answer to the industrial application of hydrogen, I think, as I already explained, for India, there's a huge potential to go over a revolution for green hydrogen, because as I mentioned, India has a very large oil and gas imports, 160 billion US dollars. It's a huge amount, and moreover, the potential for renewable energy in India is very high, and as a result of which the renewable power available is the cost of renewable power available is very less. So India has a huge potential to scale up the hydrogen technologies. Only challenge right now we are facing is the cost of production, but the cost of production can very well be brought down by large scale deployment, and that has to happen from the demand pool that I mentioned. The demand for creating green assets, the demand for these green assets, as soon as this demand is there, the hydrogen technologies can be scaled up to reduce the cost, and then I think it should be a smooth transition from there on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ratin. And it's time to wrap up this session. I will not go through a big summary of this session, but there are some key points that have come out. The first one, of course, relates to the ambition of NDCs and how it docks into also a long-term vision and long-term strategy. And in that context, transitions in the energy sector, the power sector, have been brought to the fore through the examples provided by our colleagues from Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. And the affordability of these transitions, of course, is a moot point, as is the financing of these transitions. So we heard about some financing options, such as carbon pricing, domestic emissions trading schemes, renewable energy certificates, and the like, but also some very innovative financing mechanisms, such as this contract for differences mechanisms, some financial products, but more importantly, also the importance of taking into account climate-related sovereign risks and how that would impact the financing of these transitions. So on that note, let me thank all the panelists for their very interesting presentations and extremely encouraging, I would say, developments that are taking place. And I hope, Isabel, you're enthused by what we have heard today in terms of ratcheting up of ambition, as you were talking about. The countries and the presentations that we've heard from them clearly show the commitment to this, and we hope for a very successful, not only energy transitions, but also a very successful COP26. On that note, let me thank all the presenters and the participants to this session of the Asia Clean Energy Forum, and have a restful day and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much. This is Preeti Bhandari from the Asian Development Bank signing off. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very
Have a
much.
good evening.
Bye.
Bye.